So what really is penetration testing in OT and ICS environments like? How do attackers or penetration testers break into or gain that initial foothold in the OT environment? And then how do they map not only the different systems that run Windows, but also the control systems like PLCs or programmable logic controllers or HMIs, human machine interfaces? How do we understand the relationship between those different controls and how we start to understand the logic running on those controls? Because ultimately, that's about us not only understanding the environment, but putting us in a position to where we have control over the environment and could potentially hide that control from the operators of the facility. So that's what we're going to talk about in this part. So let's just go ahead and get started. So in this part of the course, we're going to look at a high-level overview of penetration testing in OT and ICS environments. Now, when we start talking about penetration testing in OT or ICS, as we started to mention in the first part, there's a lot of misconceptions or misunderstanding of how this would actually look. I remember when I first started getting into OT back in 2010, it was, do we even have computers in power plants? And well, we must, but like, how's that actually work? And so that's partly actually what we're going to start talking about today. And so it really is, where do we start? And I wanted to take a step back and look at the main different ways that attackers get into OT environments. And when we talk about in this course, whenever we say attackers, remember, we could be using the term pen tester interchangeably. Now, of course, as pen testers, we have authorization from the owners, the operators of the environment that we're testing against. So that would be the main significant difference between pen testing and attackers. But then ultimately, we're also concerned with safety. And we're worried about operational availability of the plant that's being tested. So this goes back to an earlier conversation, right? You'll never hear me actually suggest that somebody does a pen test in an OT production environment. But we will talk about how some pen testers do that type of testing where they are keeping in mind safety and availability. Unfortunately, it's just when you're testing in OT that if you are touching control systems or even potentially some of the Windows systems in OT that the plant relies on, there could be safety and operational availability considerations. So I just want to highlight that so that you keep that in mind. When we talk about how do attackers or pen testers get into an OT environment, and this is a lot of simulations that we do in penetration testing for OT, because most attacks come from the IT network. And this should never be seen as IT versus OT. It's just a fact that we have employees and users in the IT network that are connected to the internet. They're browsing the internet, which could infect their systems. They're opening up malicious attachments and clicking on links that they shouldn't, emails, which could infect their systems. And then those infections, which become compromises, could spread potentially into the OT network. So most pen tests in OT actually will simulate attacks coming from the IT network. And we're going to talk more about this in this section and the next part as well. We talk about transitory cyber assets, right? Things that we move in and out of the plant network, like laptops that our contractors bring in and bring out, USB drives, smartphones even. And so we see all of these different types of electronic devices in and out. So we have different wireless technologies in OT environments. So we see Wi-Fi, just like we see in IT, and it brings all the same vulnerabilities. We have different control systems that run Bluetooth, which can be accessible by attackers. We have other types of RF or radio frequency transmissions in the environments, and we'll talk about some of those later on in the course. What about disgruntled employees? We think of engineers or operators especially that have intimate knowledge of how the plant operates, how a process works. They understand the physics of the environment, and more importantly, from an attacker perspective, they understand what to do to cause damage. We talk about supply chain, so hardware, software, firmware that we purchase and bring into the environment, not realizing that it could be compromised. Or later on, like we saw with the SolarWinds breach, that what happens if we go to update one of those components and that update brings in some type of malicious backdoor and compromises our systems. Not to mention all of these, but also what about cloud connectivity, which we see only growing more and more in OT environments. We want to be able to send data out to the cloud to be able to do things like predictive analytics. Some environments are already evaluating how can I create a control room out in the cloud to be able to control my plant remotely and everything in between. So there's lots of different ways that attackers or penetration testers could gain access to the OT network, and these are just a few of the different ways. And one of the reoccurring themes that we're going to be talking about as we go throughout the course is the MITRE ATT&CK framework for ICS, which documents the tactics, the techniques, the procedures, and gives us real-world documented examples of how incidents occur in the real world. Because remember, we don't have a lot of documentation or material around how to actually do penetration testing in OT networks. But we can learn by seeing what's going on in the world around us. And that's where we wanted to start. So each one of these sections you're going to see is we're going to start with a real world incident that's occurred. And so you can see based off of our timeline, we're actually going to start with one of the more recent events where we talk about FrostyGoop. Now, FrostyGoop is kind of laughed about in some respects, right? Because it's got a funny sounding name. And some people start to, they don't think of it as a quote unquote real OT or ICS attack, because it was really a simple piece of malware that took advantage of the most commonly used OT protocol, which is Modbus, and Modbus being unauthenticated, which means you're not asked for a username or password before you can issue commands. And at the end of the day, though, I want to focus on FrostyGoop because, name aside, we can see that from an attacker's perspective, that the attack only has to be as complicated or as complex or sophisticated as it needs to be to work. Meaning, the vast majority of OT environments today, you don't have to create a piece of malware like Stuxnet to be able to have an impact. And that's, to me, the beauty of the FrostyGoop incident. As horrible as the impact was to the different people that it affected, it's this lesson that, again, attacks in OT don't have to be sophisticated. We don't have to spend millions of dollars or 6 to 12 or 18 months to develop some type of customized piece of ICS malware to impact the environment. So with FrostyGoop, what had actually happened was the Russian state adversaries had disabled the heating in 600 apartment buildings, not 600 apartments, but 600 apartment buildings in the middle of winter, sub-zero temperatures outside in Ukraine. It was because the controller that was responsible for heating uses Modbus for communication. It's the most commonly used OT protocol out there because it's considered open source. So there's no licensing that you have to pay for if you're going to interact with the system running Modbus. So we see it everywhere. And in this case, we talk about there's these encode controllers that were used to control heating in these apartment buildings. So what we saw was that the attackers first got onto the OT network by finding what they believe was a MikroTik router that wasn't kept up to date. They're able to gain access to the OT network, find the controller that was responsible for heating. Again, they just connected to it over Modbus. Remember, Modbus is unauthenticated, so it never asks you for a username and password. And that allows us to make changes to the controller. So once they were able to reverse engineer the process to understand how the controller worked to in turn control the heating in those 600 apartment buildings, they could use a very simple tool, which we can see later on that we're going to rewrite in ChatGPT in just a few minutes. How they used a very simple tool to make those changes to turn the heating off. And then it took 2 days for the heating to come back on. I think it really was just for the folks that ran that were responsible for the apartment buildings. It took them 2 days to figure out what was going on. That was all because of a very simple tool. Again, we're going to see how we can recreate it in ChatGPT in only a couple of minutes. And so here's a picture coming directly from the documentation of that Enco vendor, right? That actually is responsible for making that controller, where it kind of shows how we have sensors right throughout the apartment building to understand, right, the various temperatures, right? And the controller that we can program so that it understands, right, how to control heat throughout the apartment building. And then the attacker is able to come in, interact with the controller, and essentially override certain aspects of its programming, or the control aspect for the people that own and maintain the building, to be able to turn the power or to turn the heating off. So if you think of this, again, whether it's from the attacker perspective or for the pen tester perspective, not only how can we get onto that OT network, but how do we find the different control systems on the network, like this Enco controller here, responsible for heating in the apartment building? And then how can we connect to it, and how can we manipulate it to in turn manipulate or make changes to the process in the real world that it controls? Like in this case, there was a real world process that ran the heaters to make sure that everybody stayed warm when we had sub-zero temperatures outside. So how can we inject ourselves into that process through those control systems? Now we can find these control systems that are exposed to the internet. Now in FrostyGoop, the attackers actually had to break into the OT network and gain that foothold before they were able to access that controller. Now, one of the labs that you'll do in the course, in this part of the course, will actually have you use Shodan to find these controllers. In fact, you can find these Enco controllers exposed to the internet in the Ukraine today. And you can connect to them over Telnet. And some even have Modbus exposed. So Telnet gives you this lovely menu. And you can see that it does require a password. It looks like if you're going to configure port settings or reset the device. But other than that, it doesn't look like it. But we'll see how we can also manipulate the controller essentially from behind the scenes through Modbus. And we'll actually give you the tools to be able to do that. So I've created some custom scripts that you can use, or tools that you can use. I create everything through ChatGPT. I'm not a developer. So we'll look at those. Now here's an example, and this is one of those exercises that we're going to be doing later on, much later on in the course, but looking at how we can create our own version of FrostyGoop. Now the attackers, they wrote it in Golang, which is partly where the Geo and Goop comes from. So they wrote it in Go, and they had compiled it to an exe called modbus.exe, originally named. In this case, I didn't want to use FrostyGoop. I just called it Snow Crash after one of my favorite books, because it's still related to winter, and Snow Crash is it's a cybersecurity, or I guess a futuristic cyber book. But you can see in this case, and we'll just walk through this, and this will mean more as we go throughout the course. So by the end of this course, you'll know exactly what we're talking about, and you'll be able to run these commands in your sleep. Because you can see here, in this case, we use Snow Crash, right, to be able to connect to a controller at 192.168.100.200. We're going to read, you can see the read mode. So we're going to read what they call registers. So on those controllers with Modbus, we store values in coils and registers. Coils are binary data, zeros and ones, and registers are any value from 0 to 65,535. So you can say that, you can see that we say start at address 0, which is the first register. It's 0-based numbering. I know I'm not a fan, but we're going to say start with the first register and show me the first 10 register values, and go ahead and log all that response to a file called snow.json. And you can see in this case, the controller, which is in a simulated PLC example that we're going to use shortly, you can see that it comes back and says, oh, the values for the first 10 registers are 0, 0, 0, 0, 72, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. Now, just on the surface, we don't know exactly what those mean. So that's part of our job as pen testers, or the job of attackers, is to understand what each of those values actually means. When we look at the controller and how it controls a process in the real world, and how can we make changes to impact the process in the real world. So that second command, you can see that we use, Snow Crash, the IP address. Now we're going to say, hey, I'm going to change one of those values. I'm going to change that value from 72, which in the US is considered perfect room temperature. I'm going to change that value of 72 to 5. So let's just say the logic on that controller isn't necessarily where it should be. Maybe this was enough to be able to set the desired temperature to 5 degrees, to where essentially it results in the heating being turned off. Again, it's a high-level example, but it's this idea that, again, OT tools and attacks don't have to be super sophisticated to have an impact. In part because we use protocols like Modbus, which are unauthenticated, so you can access them without usernames and passwords. And you can do things like read and write values to those controllers. Of course, to have an impact, we first have to understand what those values mean. So that's a big part of what we're going to talk about. We're going to walk through more than a few examples in this course. Again, by the time you get to the end of the course, you'll be able to do all of this in your sleep. So that's FrostyGoop. And again, a couple of lessons of why I wanted to highlight and use FrostyGoop, really to set the stage for the rest of the class. Now here you can also see how it looks when we write all that information out to that JSON file. Nothing special in this part of the FrostyGoop discussion. So let's talk about what this looks like not when we're going to turn off heating in 600 apartment buildings in Ukraine, but we want to potentially impact a power plant. Now, a power plant, and this is where I always go back to my first power plant. And this goes back to 2012. So it's what they call a combined cycle power plant, where you have a combustion chamber, which you bring in natural gas, which we see here, into that combustion chamber, and we mix it with oxygen and we create an explosion, and then we're generating heat, lots of heat. And then we take that heat and use it to create things like, well, steam when mixed with water. And then that steam will turn a turbine, and that turbine spins a generator, and that generator creates electricity. So remember, we have this real world process that we used to run manually back in the days, and you would actually have people in the plants responsible for making sure that the plant continues to generate, in this case, electricity. So over the last couple of decades, though, we had decided, right, we don't want to have people in plants, and this works in any type of facility. But we want to still be able to not only control the process, but be able to control the process, in this case, of generating electricity and bringing in natural gas to keep the heat continually being generated. That we're going to use computers. And some engineers don't like it when I say these are computers, but they are. They have processors and memory and even hard drive space. Not a ton of hard drive space, but a little. And that they're physically hardwired into these real world assets or these systems. And we do that using things like sensors. And so we bring in sensor data into the PLC, in this example, the control system. And that's called an input, right? We're bringing in data into the control system to be able to see, right? Is natural gas flowing into the combustion chamber? How fast is the natural gas flowing? We can look at the different aspects that we need to understand to be able to effectively and safely and in an optimum or optimized manner control the process. So we're bringing in data over these inputs, like through sensors. And that we can see that information, and the PLC takes that information, the control system takes that information in consideration to then be able to make changes on its own, if necessary. Or also, as humans, we have an HMI or a human machine interface that allows us to see the data on the PLC, on the control system. And that allows us in a GUI to understand what's going on. And what if we got an alert that we as humans needed to address? That's what an HMI allows us to do. Or really, I should say, the HMI and the PLC together allow us to do. It allows us to monitor what's going on in the environment, allows us to see it, right? And then we can respond, we can control that process. That's the whole idea of control systems. They allow us to monitor what's going on in the environment and make changes as necessary to be able to control it. Of course, why we're here is, well, what happens if an attacker gets into the environment? Or how do we, as pen testers, once we have that foothold in the OT network, how do we have an impact on the process? Whether we get access to the HMI, to the PLC, or to both? How do we reverse engineer that process to understand, like we saw earlier in the example with Snow Crash and FrostyGoop, what are all these numbers and what do they mean? And how can I change those numbers to have an impact in the environment? So the first lab in this part of the course, I'm actually going to do some more research, but this is actually reading the initial research that Dragos had put out on FrostyGoop. Remember, they had actually found FrostyGoop, and so they released an initial white paper on FrostyGoop, and then they actually did a follow-up webinar, and we're going to talk about all of that in a later on section when we actually come back and recreate FrostyGoop in ChatGPT. But for this first lab, you're actually going to go through the white paper. You're going to do your own research and start to see how we can learn how OT or ICS attacks work in the real world. And again, I think this is a perfect example because it shows that, again, OT, ICS attack, they don't have to be sophisticated to have a real world impact. Now, when we look at, so what's actually on an OT network? So we talked about that power plant example, right? We talked about where we're bringing in natural gas into the environment and we're using it to create heat in a combustion chamber, which ultimately is used to generate electricity. And that we're monitoring how that process works through our control systems, which also allow us as operators to see what's going on in the environment and make changes as necessary, right? To be able to control what's going on in the environment. It allows us to control that physical process out in the real world. So those are when we talk about, I always say traditional OT or the control systems, the PLCs, the HMIs, and we'll talk about some others as well, like DCS, SIS, right? A lot of acronyms if you're not familiar with those that we'll get to. And the idea is that, yeah, we have those control systems on the OT network, but guess what? There's a lot of other types of systems or computers on the control systems or the OT network. And what you'll start to see is we have systems like data historians, engineering workstations, operator workstations, file servers, Active Directory. And you can start to see all of these different systems. The one thing they have in common is they all run Windows. So when you think about from an IT perspective, right, attackers have been attacking Windows forever. And they are very good at attacking Windows and moving from the Windows machine to Windows machine and Windows machine. And that still applies in OT networks. It's the same vulnerabilities. And attackers can move from Windows machine to Windows machine. Where we slow down as attackers or pen testers is when we get to those control systems. Because then we have to realize, well, what is this type of system? What's at this one IP address? Oh, it's a PLC. Oh, that's great. Well, what exposures does that PLC have? Oh, it's running Modbus. Oh, I can connect and I can read these values, but what do these values mean? What type of programming or logic is actually running on that PLC? That's everything we have to be able to go through this process to reverse engineer. So you have to remember, while in OT, yes, we have control systems, but we also have all these Windows machines. Now, sure, there can be some Linux machines in there as well, but like in IT, we see a lot more Windows machines than we do Linux machines in OT, by far. So we have all these Windows vulnerabilities that attackers or pen testers can use to move throughout the OT environment to where then you're in a position to access those control systems like PLCs and HMIs. So when we look at, though, this idea of, well, what's the OT network? And remember, what we were talking about earlier is that the number one way attackers get into the OT network, remember, using the terms interchangeably, the number one way that pen testers get into the OT network is from the IT network. And a lot of OT networks have a lot of communication that's allowed from IT. Whether it's actually necessary or not, that's a whole other conversation when we talk about secure network architecture. It's just like in IT, you should have a firewall, and it should be configured as restrictive as possible But often what you'll see is either the firewall is misconfigured or people just simply don't understand what communication is actually required between OT and IT, which results in a lot of open pathways an attacker or a pen tester could take to gain access to the OT network from IT. So we have those pathways of communication. So keep that in the back of your mind for right now. So just remember, right, in an OT network, we have Windows machines everywhere. And sure, again, some Linux, but mostly Windows machines everywhere. Then we also have those control systems, or the OT assets. So the PLCs and the ICS we were talking about. Now, in larger environments, you can have a distributed control system, or DCS. So think of it as a PLC on steroids for now. We have, in larger environments, also safety instrumented systems, which are responsible for, well, as you imagine, ensuring safety and can shut down parts of a plant or an entire plant if there's ever a fault condition that could cause a safety issue. And then you might have heard the term SCADA. That stands for Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition. Or SCADA, really, I love the acronym because it's about what we try to accomplish with using control systems in the first place. It allows us to monitor what's going on. That's the data acquisition part. And allows us to control that real world process through the control system. SCADA is just a type of OT or ICS, but that works over wide area links, like cellular connections, or could it potentially even be a VPN over the internet? So we're going to talk about these different types of control systems, or these OT ICS assets, from a penetration testing perspective as we go throughout the course. But we will mostly focus on PLCs and HMIs because they're the most common examples of control systems you're going to see in just about any OT network out there. Now, when you look at an OT environment, we also have different OT protocols. And we want to keep in the back of our mind, well, we have all these Windows machines in the OT network, so we have all the typical Microsoft protocols, like, well, TCP/IP, right, which isn't just limited to Microsoft, but we have TCP/IP as the basis of communication most often. We have things like SMB for file and print sharing. We see Kerberos from Active Directory, right, for authenticating usernames and passwords, our credentials when users go to log in to different systems in the Active Directory domain. And the list goes on. We can still see a lot of these protocols come over from IT. So we're bringing in all of those vulnerabilities. Plus, we're adding a whole bunch more, because we have older OT protocols like Modbus that have existed for decades at this point, that have been converted over to be able to run over TCP/IP. But remember, those protocols, they were designed 20, 30 years ago, where no one was thinking about security. So they are inherently unsecure. So Modbus, S7, DMP3, Ethernet IP, BACnet, those are all these kind of standard, tried and true, popular, commonly used OT protocols that we're going to talk about in this course. Now, there's newer protocols as well that are evolving, like OPC UA, MQTT, which is an interesting protocol because it kind of straddles the line between IoT and now OT. So we're starting to see those lines blur, and potentially people wanting to integrate IoT with OT. So when we blur those lines, well, that's where we start to have those cracks that we can slip through as attackers or penetration testers. So these are the ones that we're going to talk about or focus on in this course, but there's also other ones out there, and we'll mention some additional ones as we go throughout the course, but these are the ones that we're going to primarily focus on in this course. I do have in the course materials location, remember, make sure to check the description of the video for the location of the course materials download folder, where you have access to all the different infographics, like the ones I post on LinkedIn. So here's one for Wireshark and one for Nmap. So these will come in handy for some of the later exercises, the labs, when we're actually doing things like dissecting these protocols using tools like Wireshark. So don't forget, you have access to all the course materials through that link in the course description. Now, we started to touch on earlier, remember, we have the OT network. It's almost always connected to an IT network. And then we have communication between IT and OT. And a lot of times that communication is a little bit too open. Even in an environment where they took the right step to put a firewall between IT and OT to help control the flow of traffic and limit what traffic can move from IT to OT and OT to IT, more than likely it's probably not configured correctly, and too many paths exist from IT into OT. And that's one of the most commonly type of, when I say OT Pentest today, when you go to like a company like Dragos or Mandiant, when they're doing quote unquote OT Pentest, what they're really doing most of the time is that they're actually just starting on the IT network and trying to see, can they move into the OT network or the DMZ that sits between the IT and OT networks. And that's all, because they're not touching the control systems, because that could have an impact to safety, or it could have an impact on availability. So remember, though, that OT, right, because it's comprised of so many Windows machines, it has all of the same vulnerabilities that we see on Windows machines in IT. And that, sure, the majority of OT environments now have a firewall between themselves and IT. Now, not all of them, but most, I would say, to filter traffic between IT and OT. Most of them aren't configured appropriately, or even if they are configured as restrictive as possible due to poor architecture decisions, there's too many pathways that an attacker can use to move from IT into OT. So when the attacker gains access to IT, what can they do? I just wanted to reiterate, when we talk about, if we're doing pen testing in production, right? What's the one way that we can guarantee 100% safety, right? That no one's going to get hurt, no one's going to get killed, that we're not going to do any damage or harm to the environment in which that plant resides. There isn't a way. That's why, again, you'll never hear me tell you to do full pen testing in an OT network. As much as I would love to do full pen testing in an OT network, I simply cannot tell anybody it's okay to do, because there's always that safety consideration. And yes, there's operational availability where it could crash the plant, but my main concern is with safety. But again, we'll talk about how various pen testers and attackers, right, that they still do pen testing, or they're still attacking, right? They're still in these OT networks, and they are interacting with control systems. Now, we do use the Purdue model, or what we call the expanded Purdue model, to look at how IT and OT talk to each other, even though it's not what it was initially created for. But as a way to explain or to look at pen testing in this course. Because the Purdue model was actually created to explain how, primarily in OT environments, that control systems, right, have specific communication that they need to send between assets very quickly. And that if you don't receive those commands or that data in a very short amount of time, we're talking about milliseconds or lower or quicker, that you could have safety or operational availability issues. Where in IT, you know what? When data gets there, it gets there, right? I'm copying a file from my machine up to a server. It gets there when it gets there. I make I save a Word document. The Word document is stored in the cloud. It saves when it saves. It's not the end of the world. What if I have an operator at an HMI that we were looking at earlier that sees an alert that they need to respond to immediately? Or there would be some type of, let's say, catastrophic failure that could potentially lead to, worst case, an explosion that would lead to a safety issue. When that operator makes that change, or when a control system makes that change, right, it needs to happen instantaneously. So communication between assets on the OT network have to happen much more quickly, especially between those control systems that we would talk about lower levels of the Purdue model. But we talk about now there's an expanded Purdue model that most people refer to. And we can use it as the basis for cybersecurity conversations. Again, even though the original Purdue model, no, that's not what it was designed for. But if you've not seen the Purdue model or the expanded Purdue model before, this is what it looks like. Where we look at, there's two different layers that represent the IT network. And then there's 4 layers that represent the OT network. And we have 1 layer that represents the DMZ between the IT and the OT networks. And they're actually numbered. We start at the bottom. And so you can see there's level 0. And this is where things like sensors and instrumentation live, or motors, right? The physical process, the things that are moving out in the real world, the things that are measuring, right? Things out in the real world. That's level 0. Now, remember, to monitor and control those things that we have out in the real world at level 0, well, we have our control systems like PLCs, the DCS, and SIS, the safety instrumented system. That's level 1. Remember, we as humans, we interact with the control systems using things like the HMI, or maybe an engineering workstation that we see, went the wrong way, at level 2. Level 2 is also where we see systems like the data historian, which is kind of the middle icon here. Or a data historian, that's just typically a Windows server running Microsoft SQL Server. So it's just a database server that's collecting data from all those sensors and all those control systems that tell us how the plant or the OT environment is operating. Right? How is that physical process running? If I have a power plant and I'm generating electricity, well, how much electricity am I generating? Right? That turbine that's spinning to generate the electricity, well, how fast is that turbine generating over time? Right? We can see if it fluctuates. Maybe it's going too fast or it's too slow and we need to make adjustments. What if it's starting to overheat? We'll talk about quite a few other examples as we go throughout the course, but that's a common one that I always go to. Now, those upper layers, so at layer 3, this is where we see all of kind of our back-end infrastructure for the OT network. This is where all the Windows machines like Active Directory live. And we also, you can see we have another layer of data historian. So we take that data that we collect at lower levels and we start to move it up, not only to higher levels of the OT, but eventually we get it to the IT network where the business can use that data to make decisions. Even think if I have a manufacturing facility and I'm manufacturing something like tennis balls or Barbie dolls, the business has to understand, well, how many tennis balls do we make today? Because they have to coordinate things like storage, shipping, and logistics. That all comes from the data historians, right? So we take data from OT and push it out into IT. We want to push it to IT. We don't want to allow IT to come in and retrieve it, because if we allow IT to come and retrieve it, that's another path that an attacker or a pen tester could use. So we have the IT network at levels 4 and 5. We have OT at 0 through 3. And then between IT and OT, we have what they call the IT-OT DMZ. And this wasn't in the original Purdue model, but most everybody these days talks about level 3.5. It's the IT-OT DMZ, which this is usually comprised of Windows machines, usually between 2 layers of firewalls, so that we can use it to move data in and out of the OT network securely. Well, if I need to download things like antivirus signatures or Windows updates for my Windows machines at those higher levels, like layer 2 and layer 3. We don't want to go directly to the internet, because that, if we had a direct connection to the internet from OT, an attacker could potentially use that internet connection to access OT directly. That's not what we want to have happen. So we have that DMZ between IT and OT at level 3.5, just like we would have a DMZ between IT and the internet. So that's the expanded Purdue model. So you'll hear me as we go throughout course talking about maybe a layer 2 attack, level 2 attack, or maybe we talk about, again, we'll talk about level 3.5, right? The IT OT DMZ. But that's the expanded Purdue model. Now, a lot of what we're going to talk about in the rest of this section is starting to distinguish between phase 1 attacks and phase 2 attacks. And admittedly, when I first started looking at this, and we'll look at the paper that Mike Assante and Rob Lee wrote together, was trying to understand the differences. And this is really fundamentally, and why I wanted to talk about here, it's fundamentally what we're going to be talking about throughout the rest of the course. Even though it might sound a little bit strange at first, because it can become this kind of this nuanced conversation, right, over the differences between phase 1 and phase 2. And if you've never been exposed to these, it might sound a little weird at first. But I do like to look at this in the lens of when we talk about Volt Typhoon. So Volt Typhoon is a state adversary group from China. Again, I'm just using them as an example. And we know that state adversaries come from China and Russia and the United States and every other country out there. But Volt Typhoon is an extremely large group. And they have attackers or operators, right, within their team that excel at gaining access to IT networks. And let's say they were targeting, let's say, a power plant in Guam. This is the first known instance where Volt Typhoon had been discovered. So they have a huge group of operators that they focus on breaking into IT networks. And then, since they have that knowledge of moving from Windows machine to Windows machine, right? They're very quick. They're very good at it. Then if we go back to look at the Purdue model, right? They gain access to levels 5 and 4. Well, since they're already really good at moving from Windows machine to Windows machine, then they can move really quickly into level 3.5, that IT OT DMZ. And remember, since they're really good at moving from Windows machine to Windows machine, they can move from 5 to 4 to 3.5. They could then move to 3, right? It's all Windows machines. We even have Windows machines at layer 2. So I think of phase 1 attacks. Phase 1 attacks are basically not only gaining access to the OT network, but gaining access to the OT network to then where the pen tester or the attacker is now in a position to be able to reach out and touch the actual control systems themselves, the PLCs, the HMIs, the DCS, the SIS, etc. That's really what we're talking about. So while in the next part of the course, we're going to come back and talk about a traditional IT pen test, it's really all about setting the stage for the rest of what we're going to talk about or focus on in this course, which are those phase 2 attacks. How do we map the OT network? How do we map the relationships between those assets? How do we figure out the logic running on one of those control systems to the point where we can have ultimately that impact in the environment? So going back to the Volt Typhoon example, and it's theorized that their idea was why they wanted to break into this power plant was to be able to shut down the power plant, because the power plant would generate, it actually powered a military base, and that military base, had response capabilities. And so what if the adversary wanted to interfere with those response capabilities? Well, take out the power plant, you at least have a significant impact on those response capabilities. That's one of those most common type of scenarios that you see in the military and in intelligence operations. Right? They're always talking about targeting power plants, because if you knock out the power plant, you knock out whatever the power plant is connected to. The main concern a lot of times, though, is that power plant, not only does it power some military installation, but it also could power parts of civilian infrastructure. And oftentimes military doesn't draw that distinction between impacting civilians and military, unfortunately. But with Volt Typhoon, right, they have this large group that focuses on phase 1 attacks. They're really good at Windows-based attacks, gaining access, right, getting that initial foothold, moving from Windows machine to Windows machine. So again, going back to the Purdue model, they can move 5, 4, 3.5, 3, even down to level 2 or layer 2. But then, well, what do you do when you get to a control system? That's where they hand off access to a smaller group, a small subset within Volt Typhoon. That's a smaller group that Dragos refers to as VoltSite. And VoltSite, that's the group of individuals that have the control system and the engineering knowledge, to where then they finish mapping out the OT network and mapping the relationships between those assets and understanding the logic. And then, looking at those numbers to then understand how can we make changes to have that real world impact, right? And that's where we can go back to something like FrostyGoop, where it didn't have to be complicated, to where, we could run a couple simple commands to turn off heating for 600 apartment buildings for 2 days in sub-zero temperatures. All right, phase 1 is really all of those kind of traditional IT attacks, moving from Windows machine to Windows machine, and sure, some Linux. In both the IT and the OT networks. But then it's a matter of, well, what happens when you get to those control systems? That's, again, what we're going to focus on mostly in this course. We're still going to spend a little time with phase 1 attacks, because that lays the groundwork and the foundation for phase 2. So in the next part of this course, we're going to do a high-level overview of an IT pen test. The rest of this course, from part 4 on, it's primarily focused on phase 2 attacks. Now this is what it looks like when we look at, so the IT network, and this is a kind of combination of the penetration testing execution standard, or PTES, and the IT pen test methodology. This is how I've always looked at IT pen testing. You have the pre-engagement, engagement, and post-engagement phases. Because remember, in a pen test, we have authorization. We're actually being paid by the owner of that company to break in to their network, right? To be able to identify issues in their security program. And so we have that pre-engagement. We work with the client to understand, right, their scope. What are we testing? Is it just the internal network? Is it internal and external, right? So can we break into the network from the internet? Are we going to do things like social engineering attacks? So there's kind of that fine line between defining scope and defining the rules of engagement. And then obtaining authorization. Again, that's the one thing that makes us different than the attackers. We have authorization as pen testers to do our job as long as we follow the rules of engagement. Now, the engagement them itself, right, that's the fun stuff. That's where we're doing the reconnaissance, right, trying to find ways to break into the environment. We're scanning for hosts to find ports and applications and services that are running on those assets or those hosts, those computers. And then finding out more information about those applications and those services to ultimately to where we can find vulnerabilities and exploit those vulnerabilities to gain access to those hosts. And then what do we do once we gain that initial foothold in the environment? How do we move from machine to machine? How do we actually find sensitive information to be able to steal? That's the engagement. Again, that's all the fun stuff. And then we have post-engagement. As pen testers, yeah, we have to follow up. And we have to write the final findings report. And we're going to talk about that in the very last section of the course. And that's ultimately what the client is paying for, though, right? The report that actually not only helps identify different gaps in their security program and identifies different risks that need to be addressed, but we also help them understand that risk and develop a strategy to address that risk over time, and a strategy that makes sense for them based off of their risk tolerance and how they approach cybersecurity, in this case, in OT networks. So that's an IT pen test. In OT, it'll look different. And we'll come back and talk about that. So going back to something that I had mentioned earlier, was that most quote-unquote OT pen tests that occur today, they are actually just IT pen tests. Which I know is for a lot of people that are excited, especially if they're IT pen testers today and they want to do something different, so they want to become OT pen testers. I hate to say it, but the vast majority of what you're going to do as an OT pen tester is typically the same things that you're going to do as an IT pen tester. And the most common engagement that you do as an OT pen tester is an assumed breach scenario. So you're given access to the IT network, whether that's over maybe a VPN connection, or maybe you have a system that you can deploy to the client's IT network, and then you have access to that maybe through some type of reverse shell or command and control channel out to a system you control on the internet. But the idea is that, right, we're assuming, right, that an attacker is going to gain access to the IT network, right? It's only a matter of time, right? Someone's going to click on a link, or they're going to access a website that's going to compromise their system and give access to an attacker. So we're assuming that an attacker is in the IT network. So we're giving the pen tester already that access, right? We don't want to waste money having them do things like social engineering attacks and do phishing emails. Let's not waste the time or the money. Let's focus on, okay, we're going to give you access. We're going to assume breach. We're going to give you access to the IT network, and you start from there. Maybe we even give you access to an end user or an employee workstation. Maybe we even make credentials for you, and you get an email account just like you were a normal user. So once that assumed breach, right, engagement starts, though, this is where we can look at different types of pen test activities. Again, there's lots of ways that attackers can gain access to the IT network. Again, let's not waste any money on those or the time. Let's just give the pen tester access to IT. So in this case, we have them in IT. And then it's just a matter of, can we move from IT into the IT OT DMZ? That's honestly where most quote unquote OT pen tests stop. We're just going to see, can you move from IT into the IT OT DMZ? You're not even trying to get into the OT network. We just want to see, are there any gaps between IT and OT that an attacker could use to move into the OT network potentially? And then some of these engagements do allow you to try to gain access to the OT network at that layer 3. So can you gain a foothold on in the OT network? Can you move from IT through the IT OT DMZ and then land on, more than likely, one of those Windows machines sitting on the OT network? And that's as far as you go. That's the vast majority of OT pen tests that are out there. So again, if you're really interested in OT pen testing as a job, I hate to say it, but that's what the job is. Now, what we're going to focus on in the rest of this course is, well, what happens after we get that foothold on the OT network? So sometimes some environments might allow you to do more. The vast majority might be if you get to an HMI interface or a SCADA, let's say, manager interface, then you're done. Because to go any further in that environment is going to impact safety or operational availability. When we talk about doing any type of deeper dive, that's where you're working in a test environment. Or sometimes we can actually test during what they call factory acceptance testing, and sometimes site acceptance testing. So it's before the equipment even comes on site and before it's put into a facility as it's being built. That's a one time you can say, yeah, knock yourself out. You can hammer away at this system as much as possible because it's not going to impact safety and it's not going to impact availability. But remember, the vast majority of quote unquote OT pen tests are going to be assumed breach scenarios. You start on the IT network and see if you can move into the IT OT DMZ. A lot of times, that's it. Sometimes you're allowed to see, can you gain that initial foothold on the OT network? And once you gain access maybe to that one Windows machine, you're done. That's it. In a smaller percentage, they allow you, okay, can I find an HMI screen? Can I find a web interface to log into a SCADA manager interface? That could be allowed. But then that's it. That is by far the vast amount of OT pen tests are out there. And at the end of the day, you're really just doing an IT pen test. So where do we stop the pen test? These are just those scenarios we're talking about. So again, if you're coming from an IT pen test background and you want to get into OT pen testing to do something different, the vast majority of engagements that you're going to get paid for, you're essentially doing just about the same thing. You're using the same tactics, the same techniques. The only thing is different is that you're moving through that DMZ and trying to gain access to get that initial foothold on the OT network. But the vast majority of the time, you're just moving from Windows machine to Windows machine to Windows machine. I hate to say. Now, hopefully where this class is interesting is we're going to talk about, well, what does it look like the rest of the time from an attacker perspective? Because remember, I wanted to write this course, even not necessarily really to teach how to do an OT pen test. We already said that's just IT pen testing. But to learn how do attackers break into OT networks. to where they can manipulate the process to have an impact. Because once we can understand that, that makes us better defenders in OT and ICS networks. So we take a step back, right? If we're talking about assumed breach scenarios, right? If I'm in the IT network as an attacker or as a pen tester, right? And my goal is to gain access to the OT network. Well, I have to move from the IT network to the OT through the IT OT DMZ. So I can use tools like maybe Nmap or maybe a custom PowerShell script for living off the LAN to be able to scan the IT OT DMZ subnet that faces the IT network. And I might see something like this. And this, I've seen this in IT OT DMZs before. And if you're familiar with configuring firewalls, you might say, wow, there's a lot of open ports that probably shouldn't be open. And you would be right. Because you can see at that host at 192.168.5.11, we can see ports like TCP 135, 445 that are associated with Windows, with Microsoft Windows, but also with lots of vulnerabilities with Microsoft Windows. And that's machine hasn't been patched in a while. That's complete control over that asset in the blink of an eye. And you can see even here, just by having those open on the firewall, which more than likely they don't need to be, right? We can even find out information about what type of host is there. So we can see the specific version even of Windows Server 2016. We can also see that it's running Microsoft SQL Server 2017. So more than likely, this is a data historian sitting in the DMZ. It's very common to have a data historian sitting in the DMZ. But there's no reason it should be accessible from IT. Remember, we don't want IT to reach into OT to get the information. We push the information from OT to IT. So we don't have an exposure like this, right? We shouldn't be able to see these ports from IT. You can look at that other host at 5.19. It has a whole bunch of other ports. So it still has TCP 135 and 445 that shouldn't be open. But we also see, oh, there's something running on TCP port 80, so probably some web page, some website. That website could have its own vulnerabilities. It's also running on a web server, in this case IIS 10, which it could have its own vulnerabilities. And then we can also see TCP 8530 for the WSUS or Windows Software Update Service. That's how we could be pulling Microsoft patches into OT, but that doesn't need to be exposed to IT for that to be able to operate. And then we see something else at 49152, which could be random, which might not be random. That could bear further investigation. Remember, what do we see from IT when we're looking towards the OT network? When we're looking at the IT OT DMZ, do we have any exposures there that we can use as an attacker or pen tester to move from IT into the IT OT DMZ? Like in this case, if those machines aren't patched and haven't been patched in a couple months, maybe 6 months, I'd say it's pretty guaranteed path from IT into the IT OT DMZ. So in lab 2.2, what you're going to do is you're going to review an Nmap scan, kind of like we were just looking at, and use it to find different exposures. I did create a simulated environment you could put on your system to do scanning to simulate an IT OT DMZ, but it could potentially crash your machine. So I figured it was to best avoid that. I'm working on some online labs that actually will be accessible for free that you can use also to do that scanning. But for now, for this part of the course, we're just going to review the scanning output. And then I think there's one more research lab, and then everything else is hands-on. So for this, though, I did want to walk through some examples, right, of what we could see from the IT network that we could use to be able to move from IT into OT. So that's lab 2.2. So now we talked about the most common types of OT pen tests, right? Which really are just IT pen tests in disguise. Right? We're doing the assume breach and moving from Windows machine to Windows machine. When we talk about true OT pen testing, though, which again is, or true OT attacks, this is where, okay, we already have the foothold on the OT network. We've already probably even mapped out a bunch of the assets on the OT network itself. So we have a pretty good idea of the different assets. Maybe, oh, there's a PLC over here, some domain controllers over here, file server, maybe a couple data historians. But where do we go from there? That's really where we start phase 2 attacks. Again, that's what we're going to be focusing on in this course. So when you look at the engagement phase now in phase 2, we talk about going from reconnaissance to having an impact in the environment. Those phases, when I talk about reconnaissance through impact, that's coming from MITRE ATT&CK for ICS. So remember, MITRE and Dragos and some others had come together to document based off of real world incidents. And how do attackers get into OT? But not only how do they get into OT, but most importantly, what do they do once they're inside OT to ultimately be able to put themselves in a position to have an impact on the process, or the physical process running in the outside world. Now we started to touch on some of the realities of OT pen testing, but again, I want to level set for everyone. So again, if you're thinking of maybe starting an OT pen testing company, right, or moving from IT to OT pen testing, again, I just want to level set. I know I'm going to break some hearts because my heart was broken when I first realized these things. But there's not a lot of actual business out there for OT pen testing. When I look at it, OT pen test, just like in IT, right? Is it something that you should do? Yes. But in the priority of all the things you can do to secure your environment, pen testing is usually at the bottom of the list for most organizations. Just because it's usually seen as expensive. And while it does reduce your risk some, it is pretty limited compared to other security controls that I can invest in, like putting a firewall between IT and OT. I could put a firewall in between IT and OT maybe for $500, and yet that reduces the vast majority of my risk in the environment versus spending $80,000 on an OT pen test that would reduce my risk maybe 1/1000th of the firewall. So there isn't a lot of work for OT pen testing out there. Not to mention, another reason is the vast majority of OT environments out there, they don't have the money. Sure, there's companies out there like Shell, BP, right? I always think of the big oil companies. Saudi Aramco, most of these are customers in my day job. They invest very heavily in their OT cybersecurity programs, and sure, they invest in OT pen testing. But there are only so many large oil and gas companies out there. And there's only so many, power plants out there that are owned by organizations with the money to be able to invest to do OT pen testing. You have to remember the vast majority of OT environments, they're very small. Small manufacturers, small water utilities, small power utilities. They don't have the money. They don't have the funds to do OT pen testing. And when somebody does reach out, because I have people reach out all the time on LinkedIn asking if I can do a OT pen test. And yet they're like, oh, we're just starting our cybersecurity program for OT. We need a pen test. And like, no, you don't need a pen test. You need a risk assessment, a maturity assessment. You need to understand where you're at today, and let's help build you a strategy on how you're going to apply different security controls to protect your environment, you don't need a pen test, right? Pen tests are only for the most mature OT cybersecurity programs. And as we've already mentioned, again, if you want to do OT pen testing, like as a career to do something different, if you're already an IT pen test, I hate to say it, but most of what you're going to be doing as a paid gig is essentially an overglorified IT pen test. It's called an OT pen test, but all you're really doing is using the same skills, the same techniques to move from Windows machine to Windows machine, from the IT network to the IT, OT, DMZ, to maybe get a foothold on the OT network. But again, I just want to level set. I'm sorry to break anybody's hearts out there, but I just want to level set. Good news, at least for the rest of this course, right, we're focused on, well, what happens, right, when an attacker does get that foothold in the environment? Or what if you had a completely, test environment set up for you to be able to attack? Well, then what do you do? Again, that's what we're going to talk about in the rest of the course. So yeah, we're going to look at phase 1. And again, next part, we're going to do a walkthrough of an IT pen test. Not going to take too long, but again, to level set, to then how we make that transition into phase 2, which is what we're going to talk about in the rest of the course. Again, we're not trying to teach IT penetration testing here. There are some great resources out there, even free courses like that Heath Adams or the Cyber Mentor TCM Security does on YouTube for free. But we're just doing it to level set so you can see the differences between phase 1 and phase 2. So the last lab in this section, this is where you're going to read that paper I mentioned earlier that was written by Mike Assante and Rob Lee. Mike Assante is considered the godfather, or one of, but very few, but most consider him the godfather of OT ICS cybersecurity. The field wouldn't exist without Mike Assante. And then, unfortunately, Mike had passed away a few years ago. One of his, pupils or Padawans, if you want to use Star Wars terminology, was Rob Lee. And Rob Lee, of course, the CEO of Dragos being probably, I think, to many, the world's most recognized OT, ICS, cybersecurity company, especially when they focus on things like threat intelligence, incident response, pen testing, right? That they wrote this paper to talk about phase 1 and phase 2 attacks. And they use the Lockheed Martin kill chain to explain how it occurs. I'm not the biggest fan. I know some people aren't the biggest fan of the Lockheed Martin kill chain because it has that, I don't know, almost like government military feel to it. So if you come from a government or military, or maybe you're in a 3-letter agency, like an intelligence agency, it'll be right up your alley. You'll feel at home. I think for those of us that, don't come from that type of background, it just doesn't feel, I don't know. It's not as easy maybe to understand as kind of how I've laid it out. That's how I've laid out the IT and the OT pen test, just to make it easier for myself to understand. I think it's a little bit more simpler and more straightforward. Right? But you will see in the paper, right, how they talk about the differences between phase 1 and phase 2, and how we can also use the expanded Purdue model to talk about how OT pen testing works. So that's the last lab in this section. Again, every other lab in this course is going to be hands-on. So I promise no more research. So that brings us to the end of the section. So if you made it all the way to this part, I really appreciate it. Thanks for hanging in there. I hope you learned a lot. If you enjoyed listening or watching, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in part 3.